You ran the wrong way. In 1964, the Minnesota Vikings were playing the San Francisco 49ers, and in this game, one of the 49ers wide receivers made a catch, but then he was tackled and he fumbled the football. And a Vikings player whose name was Jim Marshall ran over and picked up the football and started running to the end zone with nobody in front of him. There was only one problem with this picture, though. He was running in the wrong direction. He went to the wrong end zone. And so as he sprinted to the end zone, as there was nobody in front of him, as he had a clear path ahead of him, he was so excited to go and score a touchdown, he realized that he had gotten to the end zone, he chucked the ball out of the end zone out of excitement, and his teammates came up to him and told him, "You ran the wrong way." And he scored points for the 49ers and not for his Vikings. When we look at Jonah chapter 1, we also see someone who is running the wrong way. But unlike Jim Marshall, who didn't know that he was running the wrong way in the moment, Jonah did know that he was running the wrong way. The problem that Jonah confronts us with in this passage in chapter 1 is that we try to escape God even though we belong to him. See, we try to escape God even though we belong to him. But the big idea of the passage is this, that because we are his, we must go where God calls us. Because we are his, we must go where God calls us. But to understand where God calls us, we actually need to look at Jonah do the opposite. We need to look at him go down to Joppa. We need to look at him go down into the boat, and we need to look at him go down into the sea. And so the first part, he goes down to Joppa. The chapter begins quickly and abruptly, and it describes the word of the Lord having come to the individual Jonah. Different than many of the other minor prophets, we don't get an indication of who exactly Jonah is. We also aren't told when exactly this happened. Jonah is likely a prophet who shows up in the book of 2 Kings. He was active in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC and during the reign of King Jeroboam II. He was actually a contemporary of Amos and Hosea, two other minor prophets that we've gotten to look at thus far. As the book begins, it begins similar to many of the other minor prophets. The word of the Lord comes to Jonah, and he is called to respond to it. But in other minor prophets, however, when the book opens in this fashion, usually what you see is a whole book it contains all the things that God has commanded that prophet to proclaim, which he goes on doing. But here, Jonah is only commanded to do one single thing, and that's to go to the city of Nineveh. God tells Jonah, "Arise, go to Nineveh, to that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." God is calling his chosen servant to go, to call out this people for their sin, and you would expect, like the other minor prophets, that he would go and do just that. Now, the city Nineveh, it was in the far northeast, away from where Jonah was located at. And Nineveh was a royal Assyrian city, which today is located in northern Iraq. Nineveh was known primarily in this time for its violence. The prophet Nahum actually describes it as the city of blood and a place of constant cruelty. And it was this very place that God was calling Jonah to proclaim his word. At this point, we would typically then see the prophet go and follow God's direction, but a shift happens immediately. Jonah does not listen to God. And in fact, he heads in the opposite direction. He flees from the Lord, as the text says, heading all the way down to Tarshish. Now, to give some perspective here, a boat ride from then Joppa to Tarshish in this day would have taken about a year. So it would have been a long, expensive journey for Jonah to make it all the way to the land that he was going to. Jonah wasn't merely going for a holiday weekend in Monterey. He wasn't doing that. Rather, he had an expensive, possibly all the money that he had, one-way ticket to a land that was as far away from where God was calling him to, away from the presence of the Lord, as the text says. The Lord had called Jonah to arise. But Jonah's response was to go down and to flee the presence of the Lord. In this pivotal moment in Jonah's life, as he is called by God to go somewhere that he doesn't want to go to, but instead runs away from God, He's called to run towards him, maybe in his fear and his doubts, but he runs away from him. And what's amazing about even just the 3 verses that begin this book, these 3 verses give insight to the purpose of the whole book. You see, the vague nature of these first 3 verses are set up in such a way as if it is alerting the reader to the possibility that we too are involved in a similar flight than Jonah. Already the book is opening the door and painting a picture that we are like Jonah. As God is calling Jonah toward a people who seem to be guilty of great violence and evil, we might sympathize with Jonah. It seems plausible, right, that Jonah wouldn't want to go to a violent place. But as the book unfolds, we'll find that at the core of all of this, Jonah just really hates God's direction for him. And he just really doesn't want to go towards the Ninevites that God is calling him to, not because he is afraid of them, but because he doesn't like them, because he despises them. So what does he do? He flees from God. This can happen when someone experiences hurt in the church. They may very well have legitimately been hurt, but instead of running toward God and toward his people, they run from him and have refusal to do anything to do, or refuse to have anything to do with him. And we in the church do the same thing. We make plausible excuses not to do what God is calling us to do or to go to those whom he is calling us to go to. And we make these plausible excuses because we hate God's direction, and sometimes we hate those he is calling us toward. Jonah's flight to Joppa is reflective of how we flee from him and our attitude towards his leading of us. We also understand from this text where God calls us when we see Jonah go down into the boat. So from verses 4 through 10, Jonah gets on the boat to Joppa. But on their way, God sends a huge storm, a storm that was so big that it threatened to destroy the boat and to take the lives of those on it. Now here we find our second big surprise of the chapter. It's the response of the mariners, of the sailors, immediately when the storm hits. The mariners begin to cry out to their gods. In their fear to turn away from their physical means, they turn to spiritual means. They seek help from a higher power who can deliver them, any higher power. And then they begin to throw cargo overboard to help lighten the load to give some possibility to their surviving. But in the midst of them doing this, in the midst of them even turning away from physical means to spiritual means, where was the prophet Jonah? Where was the one who had been called by the true and living God, who had actually sent this storm, who was responsible for this storm in the first place? Well, for a second time, Jonah goes down. This time he had descended into the inner parts of the boat where he was not praying, where he was not making a practical effort to help them and to rescue them from the storm, but where he was asleep. So the captain of the boat goes to him and says to him, "Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." Once again, using the same word that God used already, Jonah is called to arise. But Jonah actually doesn't answer. So the mariners then proceed to cast lots, which is a way that God called his people at this time to discern his will, and the lot falls on Jonah. And so they said to him, "Tell us, on whose account has this evil come upon us?" And now Jonah responds and says who he is and admits that the storm had come because of him. "I am a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And how do the mariners respond? They respond with fear of the Lord. Unlike Jonah, who knows who God is, who knows that he cannot escape God because, as he said, he's the one who created all things. Even with this knowledge, he still seeks to put physical distance between himself and the place that God was calling him to. But while Jonah has the right knowledge of God, the right knowledge of who God is, it is he who is responding as if he didn't know God in the first place. And while the sailors who didn't really know God, they knew something of him, but they didn't know God in the way that Jonah knew God, they respond to him as if they know him intimately well. Even though Jonah knew God, he went down into the boat and he hid himself. And just like Jonah, you and I hide ourselves. While Jonah was fleeing from God, he decided to hide himself below in the boat in the midst of the great storm. You and I also hide ourselves from God too, don't we? We see Jonah fleeing from accountability. The sailors are seeking for an answer as to why this storm was happening so that they could find a way to put a stop to it. And Jonah knows exactly why the storm was happening, and he knows exactly how to put a stop to this storm. He was fleeing from where God had called him. But at every turn, he resists accountability. He hides himself. He goes below, further into the boat, and still further away from where God had called him to go. We do this. We hide from God. We hide from accountability. One way we do this in the suburban context that we find ourselves in is we hide ourselves in our busyness. We're too busy to do the hard work in our lives that needs to be done. The other way that we do this is we hide ourselves in fake accountability or in echo chambers, in groups of people where we don't have to face our sin or talk about our sin, where we can live in a sort of echo chamber where we know that those people will only affirm all that we say, do, and think without ever questioning or challenging us. In light of this upcoming election on Tuesday, sometimes we hide in our political parties. We get stuck thinking our party can do no wrong and the other party can do no right. But can you listen to the challenges of the other party? And if not, you might be hiding in some sort of echo chamber that only affirms what you believe and refuses to hear another viewpoint. We flee and we hide, just like Jonah. We also understand where God calls us when we see how Jonah went down into the sea. The passage continues of verse 11 on. The men asked Jonah what they should do. Again, up to this point, Jonah has identified himself. This is his big chance, though, to say, hey, let's turn this ship around. The sea grew more and more dangerous, continuing to put the lives of all on board at risk. And the sailors turn to Jonah. They ask him what they should do. Jonah knows exactly what they should do. Jonah knows exactly why they're in the situation that they are in. But instead of saying, hey, maybe we should try and turn the ship around and go back in the direction where God had called me, Jonah doesn't do that at all. Instead, he loathes himself. Jonah has an opportunity here, a pivotal one, a choice to face where God was calling him to go, but instead of following where God was calling him to, he would rather die. Instead of facing his own sinfulness and his own sinful view of the Ninevites, as we will see in a couple of weeks, Jonah would rather die. Jonah would rather die than face his sin and change. Jonah wants something different, as shown by his going down to flee to Tarshish, but Jonah does not want to change. Jonah would rather spend his life savings, would rather travel to a faraway place, would rather be drowned in the depths of the sea than to change. He simply says to the mariners, pick me up and throw me into the sea, for I know that it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Instead of looking out for the interest of the sailors whose lives he had endangered in the first place, instead of attempting to turn the ship around and to go back where God had called him to, Jonah whines and tells the sailors to throw him overboard so he could die. And once again, as we'll see many times in the book of Jonah, the sailors respond in a surprising way. Despite Jonah's request to be thrown overboard and drowned, the sailors don't immediately go through with it. Instead, they try to turn the ship around. They try to do the very thing that Jonah was supposed to be doing. They rowed harder and harder as the storm was raging harder and harder, but the men were unable to turn the boat around and go back to dry land. Their effort fails. And so what do? They turn to God. They pray to God. They address God by his covenantal name that was reserved only for him and his people. And they go to him and they pray to him. Then, not wanting to throw Jonah overboard, even despite him putting them in this position in the very first place, they then went through with it and finally threw him overboard. After the fact, the storm ceased. The sailors, unlike Jonah, they feared God exceedingly. And as a result, they made a sacrifice to him. Those who did not know God in the way that Jonah knew God are responding to him as if they had known him all along. And Jonah, who does know God, is responding to him as if he doesn't know him at all. But the chapter ends with a plot twist. This is actually not the end of Jonah's life at all. This is not the end. The chapter ends on this massive cliffhanger where God appoints a fish to come and to swallow up Jonah, inside of which he would spend the next 3 days and 3 nights. Each time Jonah is called to rise, it only leads to him descending lower and lower and lower, and the chapter ends with Jonah in the lowest possible place, which is in the belly of a giant fish deep in the sea. You cannot get lower than that. Now, I won't spoil what's coming next. You'll hear what's coming next in the coming weeks, but to understand something about Jonah chapter 1 within itself, we need to understand something about the sign of Jonah that Jesus gives. In Matthew chapter 12, and we can get up on the projector, Matthew 12, Jesus is speaking to the religious leaders of his day. And he speaks directly about this scene in Jonah, the end of Jonah. And he says this, "And some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered him, saying, 'Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you.' But he answered them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here.' While the scribes and the Pharisees demand a sign from Jesus, of which, if you've read this gospel up to this point, Jesus had already provided a multitude of signs, Jesus turns to the religious leaders. He turns to the religious leaders who, like Jonah, should have known better. The religious leaders who had God in the flesh standing right before them, but were running in the opposite direction away from him. And Jesus says to the religious leaders, he says, 'Here is the sign that I'm going to give to you. It's the sign of Jonah. Just as he spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so I will spend 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Something greater than Jonah is here.' Now, what did Jesus mean by this? Just as God had appointed a fish for Jonah, so God appointed a cross and a tomb for his son. While Jonah loathed himself and got himself thrown into the sea for selfish reasons, Jesus threw himself into the sea of God's wrath for selfless reasons. While Jonah took every opportunity to rise in this chapter, to go further and further down and away from where God was calling him to, Jesus willingly went down into the depths in order that we would be brought out of the depths. While God appointed a fish to keep Jonah from drowning, so Jesus keeps us from drowning by going down into the sea for our place in order that we would be lifted up and out of it. While this chapter ends open-ended, leaving us not sure whether or not Jonah will finally rise. Will he finally rise? Jesus has rose. And Jesus has done so that you and I would be brought to God. Like Jonah, we think that God just wants to kill us, that he doesn't have our best interest in mind. So we don't receive him, and we don't trust in him, and we run in the opposite direction of him. But what Jesus shows us by this sign and by his life, death, and resurrection is that he doesn't want to kill us. Rather, he wants to save us. And he wants to take us on an adventure that we could never have imagined for ourselves. And he simply calls us to receive him and to rest on him and to go on the adventure that he calls us on and to. Please pray with me.